Hey guys, we're doing predictions for UFC Fight Night 120, Poirier versus Pettis. Follow me on Twitter. My link will be in the description at MMA Breakdown 0. I'm sorry for missing my video for UFC 217, guys. It's unfortunate and I hate it when it happens, but what can you do? That's how life goes sometimes. But getting this one out, a week out, and I will make a big effort on my part to have all of my videos out for the rest of the cards for this year, at least a week ahead of time. But for UFC 217, bad night of picks for me as far as fantasy was concerned. I think I went 4 for 11, so really not good at all. But it was one of the first events in a while that I made money on for my bets. I parlayed Vic and Namajunas, and that obviously paid out very nicely. And then I bet on Paulo Borrachina inside the distance, which was a good bet. And I made some other losing bets, but net made a decent sum of money. Nothing that I'm sure most of you would be excited about, but for me it was a big positive, and just feel like I'm still collecting information, always refining the betting strategy, and I'm just trying to be more disciplined, more intelligent with every event, and I hope that I can make some more profitable picks for this card, and hopefully close the year out with a positive net position. But let's get into this card. So starting off with the Fight Pass prelims at middleweight, Darren Stewart versus Carl Roberson. I have to kind of throw my arms up, throw my hands up in the air for this one. There's very little footage of either guy out there. Roberson, other than his very quick first round stoppage on Dana White's Contender Series, couldn't find any footage of him at all. And Darren Stewart, couldn't find any of his recent pre-UFC fights. So going off of very little here, I think I'll take Roberson. I liked his finish on the Contender Series. I don't know anything about his opponent, what level of opposition he was. But Roberson also has some K1 experience, and finishing his opponent with his back to the fence with the forearm across the face, defending the takedown and landing elbows from there, I think is evidence of him being a very powerful, devastating striker, and probably having a lot of crafty skill to be able to get a knockout like that from a disadvantageous position. But Darren Stewart, while the loss to Bahos was a pretty bad one for his resume, he does look like a good athlete, explosive, decent wrestling ability, really goes after guys. But yeah, losing to Bahos, not a good thing. And I think I have to take Roberson. The guy he fought shot in on him pretty explosively, and I think he defended the takedown just fine. I think he may be able to figure out Stewart, if not from the outset, if Stewart's able to take him down early. I don't know, Stewart seems a little undisciplined, and if he can't get the finish, I think Roberson might take over on the feet. So going off of very little there, may very well end up changing this pick, but just based on the information I have, I think I would go with Roberson. All right, at light heavyweight, Jake Collier versus Marcel Fortuna. I'd go with Fortuna here, definitely, just because he's the more skilled guy, but it seems to me to be a pretty low IQ fighter. When I was researching him for his debut against Anthony Hamilton, I saw some really good grappling skills from him pre-UFC, and seems to have totally thrown those out the window since entering the UFC. And his knockout against Anthony Hamilton's probably responsible for that. And his fight against Johnson seemed to exclusively only want to strike and was only looking to time the big knockout shot that never came, and just got outworked, lost on volume. He's not a natural knockout striker, and that, you know, fighting in that way could leave the door open for Collier to outwork him, to just beat him on volume. If he can't knock out Collier, who's not the most durable guy, but at the same time tough. But I'd still take Fortuna, even if he doesn't get this to the ground and just looks to strike with Collier, because Collier is not a very skilled guy, fairly unathletic. You know, against better athletes like Devin Clark, Dongyi Yang, Vitor Miranda, they end up just destroying him. And while Fortuna, you know, is not a natural striker, I think is just skilled enough to probably edge this one out if he doesn't hurt Collier. So I'd go with Fortuna just based on skill, but that's kind of an ugly fight. You know, Fortuna, his fight decisions, not very good, and you know, I could see Collier possibly winning that one. All right, at welterweight, Court McGee versus Sean Strickland. This is my most confident pick of the card. Going with Sean Strickland. I think he pretty much beats McGee without much difficulty at all. McGee's getting up there in age, losing several steps athletically, and just has a skill set that's kind of outdated at this point. He's a boxer wrestler, and that's not to say that he's a bad fighter. You know, the guy has a win over Robert Whittaker. Even in the Ponzinibbio fight a couple years ago, before getting knocked out, he was landing some good shots on Ponzinibbio to start that fight. So the guy's game, but I just think that style's way too limited to beat Strickland, who's a new breed fighter, kind of epitomizes that term. Just a very fluid, cerebral striker, really patient and composed, has unassuming power. We saw that against Alex Garcia. And, you know, can finish on the ground as well. This guy survived against Kamaru Usman, against Ponzinibbio, and Usman's like the perfected version of what McGee is trying to be. And if he could survive against him, McGee, you know, I don't think has any trouble or has any chance of beating him. So I see Strickland just picking him apart with a long jab all fight long, maybe finishing him off in the third round. McGee, if you think of some of the other longer, more technical strikers he's fought, like Costa Philippou, even Dongyi Yang, they gave him a lot of problems. So yeah, I really like Strickland here. Confident pick, and I'll be betting big on Strickland. All right, at women's strawweight, we're on to the FS1 prelims now. Angela Hill versus Nina Ansaroff. I imagine this will be an upset pick, but I'm taking Ansaroff. I really liked her performance against Barter. Thought she showed pretty serious development in her hands and in her ground game from the Kish fight, and I think is just going to be too grounded and have too much effective offense for Hill. I was not impressed with Hill against Yoder. You know, was kind of getting outstruck, or at least eating shots from a grappler, and did get taken down a few times. Yoder did attempt some chokes on her, and just made it a really tough fight for Hill to get any kind of real rhythm going on the feet. Ansaroff is more of a combination striker. Her hands looked really fast against Liebarger and showed a decent takedown and some really good ground control. Like I just said, Yoder had some brief success, again, on top of Hill in that fight. So I think Ansaroff, will have the more effective, straightforward offense. Hill, is a better athlete, maybe physically stronger than Ansaroff, but her striking is kind of a lot of big movements and one-off shots, but not really impactful fight-changing shots. So yeah, I like Ansaroff's technique, her skill. I think she can win a decision here. But not a hugely confident pick at the same time. I mean, only has 2 fights in the UFC. Hill, I thought, gave Andrade a tough fight. But I just think she's kind of stagnated in her development while Ansaroff is making some big strides. So I'm going to take Ansaroff, but probably not confident enough to bet in it. All right, lightweight, Sage Northcutt versus Michelle Quinones. Really like Sage Northcutt here. Quinones is going to give him the exact kind of fight that he wants. He's going to strike with Sage. He's going to strike with him in the style that Sage strikes and is or should be much better at least on paper. That long range, dynamic, creative striking. And Quinones, none of his pre-UFC fights that I was able to see, not a lot of footage out there, but from what I was able to see, wasn't really that impressed. Doesn't look like that lethal of a striker. And then against Jared Gordon, did okay on the feet, didn't really land anything that meaningful, and once it got to the ground, just got torn up there and kind of quit once Gordon was able to really open up with his ground and pound. So yeah, I like Northcutt. Should be a lot more athletic, more powerful, and just more skilled and more creative than Quinones on the feet. And Quinones won't, be able to threaten him. I don't imagine with a takedown game like Enrique Marin or Mickey Gall attempted to do, or even Brian Barberane. I think this is going to be strictly a long-range kickboxing match, and Northcutt, I just think, has all the advantages from athleticism to power to technical striking. So I really like Northcutt, and that is my second most confident pick of the card. All right, at women's strawweight, Tatiana Suarez versus Viviane Pereira. I think Suarez should take this one. She's a really talented, dominant wrestler, very good chain submission grappler. And this would be my third most confident pick on the card. Viviane Pereira is pretty basic with her overall game, but she's scrappy, she's tough, and I'm a little bit concerned of the layoff here for Suarez, 1.5 years since she won TUF, and we don't know what her striking looks like, even against tough level competition. We didn't get to see her strike in her 2 fights on TUF. Both of those, she was able to get her opponents to the ground immediately and keep them there the whole fight. If she's not able to get the takedown, which I think is pretty unlikely, then Pereira may just be scrappy enough and have enough constant pressure on the feet to possibly win a round or 2. But I think that's unlikely. Valerie Latorno took Pereira down off of a kick in their fight in the first round and was able to get some ground and pound off, started working for a Kimura. Pereira got up pretty quickly, but even just a small window like that against someone as dangerous as Suarez with her submissions and with her scrambling, I think could spell the end for Pereira should Suarez get that opportunity. So I'm taking Suarez. That would be my third most confident pick and probably still is. I just can't quite say it's a lock because of the layoff and because her striking is still unknown. All right, at bantamweight, John Dodson versus Marlon Moraes. This is a really tough fight. Moraes, his problem in the Rafael Assuncao fight was just lack of activity, lack of urgency, and really got bogged down by the slow pace of that fight, by Assuncao's kind of overly patient style and unwillingness to really engage. And I thought he looked better than Assuncao in that fight. I think he's the more technical striker. It's more power, I think, behind his strikes, but it was just such a slow fight that it was pretty uneventful that either guy could have won, and Assuncao won. If he's that patient against Dodson, I think Dodson, he's usually the aggressor in his fights, and he could offer enough volume, come forward enough to outland Moraes and steal a decision, and kind of like what Assuncao did, but to a greater degree. But I think that Moraes, he's a lot more technical than Dodson. Dodson's he's kind of exposed himself as a guy whose game was only ever really predicated on his athleticism, and is really kind of suffering from a lack of technique in recent fights. And I think also this matchup will be easier for Moraes to get shots off in. I think he'll be able to apply his offense easier than in the Assuncao fight, because Dodson does come forward more, does look to engage more. And, let's not forget that Dodson, in that Makovsky fight, I thought got outstruck and outpointed. Really struggled to find a rhythm against Wineland, who was really not offering him anything, not posing a threat. So I just think Moraes, with his tactics, his leg kicks, and really having more power behind his strikes at this point in their respective careers, I think we'll be able to land the harder shots here, the more meaningful shots, and win a decision. So I'm going with the technique of Moraes over the potentially higher output, higher aggression game of Dodson. But that's a real close one. I can see either guy winning that. That's a tough one to call. All right, on to the main card. Lightweight Joe Lauzon versus Clay Guida. This is a super intriguing matchup. Lauzon striking almost without fail has been abysmal throughout his UFC career. Kind of a wonder that he was able to stop Diego Sanchez, become the first guy to stop him with strikes. And Guida, on the other hand, has been developing an effective striking style, not to put anyone down, but can at least score points, win rounds, and at the very least use his shots to set up his takedowns, to close the distance and set up takedowns like he did pretty flawlessly against Coke. But I'm a little worried about Guida's submission defense here. When he fought Thiago Tavares a couple years ago, got guillotined off of his first takedown attempt in transition and got submitted. When he fought Hioki, everyone thought he lost because of Hioki's guard game, even though Hioki was on his back for that entire fight. So Guida's never really been a really capable MMA grappler once it hits the mat. But at the same time, Lauzon hasn't submitted anyone since 2012. That was against Jamie Varner. Guida has survived against good guard players like Anthony Pettis. Yeah, so I think that Guida is going to be able to score enough on the feet, possibly hit some takedowns. And as long as he can survive that submission attempt, or can survive those submission attempts by Lauzon, I don't really see him getting finished on the feet. He can keep just as high a pace as Lauzon, if not outwork him. You know, Guida's the king of cardio and pace. And with that newfound kind of elusive striking style, I think he'd be able to outpoint Lauzon on the feet. So I have to go with Guida by decision, but this is going to be a scrap, and you know, would not be willing to bet on this one. This one, more than any other fight on the card, I think could just go either way. So coin flip, but I'm going Guida by decision. All right, at bantamweight, Rafael Assuncao versus Matthew Lopez. I think Assuncao, just being the far more experienced fighter against very high-level fighters and being the more technical guy on the feet, and probably, well, not as dangerous a grappler as Lopez, but I think has good enough takedown defense that he could keep this on the feet, where he is more technical. You know, having those advantages, I think, is going to be enough to get him the win here. Matthew Lopez, he's a rising prospect, though. You know, against Johnny Eduardo, was kind of getting lit up, but was able to land some hard shots himself. And then once he hit the takedown, he dominated Eduardo on the mat, was able to pound him out. You know, showed really good top control. So, you know, the guy's capable. I just don't really see him taking Assuncao down. Assuncao's a really good counter striker, really quick hands. But at the same time, you know, this is a guy who against, well, we already talked about his fight against Moraes. You know, he's a pretty patient guy, and almost to a fault, and he could have lost that decision. A guy like Lopez, who's aggressive, looking for the finish, I could see him, you know, coming forward and just taking more chances, possibly allowing him to hurt Assuncao or just landing more to win the decision. And also the Sterling fight, you know, Sterling, you know, wasn't anywhere near the level of striker that Assuncao was, but just kind of going to that body kick over and over again, was able to land enough to take him to a split decision. So Assuncao's a guy who definitely can be outworked, even if he's the more technical guy. And that's possible here with Lopez, but I still see Assuncao as just being too good a counter striker, too good at kind of slowing the pace down and staying defensive and being able to hit his opponents without being hit. For Lopez to get the win here, I think he's still too young. But you know, it's definitely possible that Lopez could steal this one. I'm gonna go with Assuncao by decision, but not one I'd bet on. All right, a middleweight, Nate Marquardt versus Cesar Ferreira. I like Ferreira here. You know, Marquardt could land something from the outside. Those knockout wins over Tamden McCrory and CV Dalloway were really nice. But Ferreira, I think, is better at really capitalizing on openings like he did to Jack Hermanson. And especially with his takedowns, that's become his main weapon, is timing those takedowns from outside, and I think he can do that against Marquardt. Marquardt just seems to kind of not really have his heart in it. You know, I don't know what really went on in that Belfort fight. But Marquardt started off great, was the more active guy, hit a takedown on Belfort, never went to it again for the rest of the fight, and seemed to just kind of shut down and not throw any offense. So I'm taking Ferreira. This guy's been fighting better guys than Marquardt, like Hermanson, Theodorou in his most recent fight, which was still a close fight. He just kind of got outworked on the feet. But I don't see Marquardt throwing enough volume to outwork Ferreira or really have a chance to knock him out. I think of the two guys who are both kind of technical range strikers, I think Ferreira finds those openings better and is more devastating when he does. So I'm going to go with Ferreira, but you know, this guy's got a terrible chin. It's been a while since he's been knocked out, but you know, there was a while there where he was kind of the Overeem of the middleweight division, you know, getting knocked out by Masvidal, Dalloway. Was he knocked out by... Yeah, he was knocked out by Dalloway, right? Everyone knocked this guy out. So I'd be a little hesitant here to really be confident in Ferreira, but he is my pick. All right, at heavyweight, Andre Arlovski versus Junior Albini. This is a good matchup, good test for Albini. Was really impressed with his knockout win over Timothy Johnson. Seemed to show some technical pocket boxing ability, which we don't see from many heavyweights. And I think that could serve him really well against Arlovski here, who's a chinny guy, who's just kind of falling apart a little bit with each successive fight. Just getting up there in age, his chin seems to be getting a little worse with each fight. So my pick is Albini by knockout, just being the much younger guy and having big power. I think that's a bad recipe for Arlovski here. But Arlovski is still a talented striker, you know, and Albini seems kind of like a plotter. I could see Arlovski being the more quick-footed guy here, having better footwork, kind of dancing around him in open space and, you know, creating an opening like he did against Bigfoot Silva, faking the jab and then coming over with the cross. Yeah, my pick is definitely Albini, but at heavyweight with two knockout strikers, especially one guy being as green as Albini, only having one UFC fight, and Arlovski is definitely a big step up from Johnson. You know, I think it's too risky to bet on, but I would go with Albini by knockout. All right, at welterweight, Matt Brown versus Diego Sanchez. I think this should be an amazing fight. If you were feeling at all a little bit dissatisfied with fights like Brown versus Lawler or you know, Brown versus Cerrone, some of these fights that should have absolutely lived up to the hype and maybe just fell a little bit short, I think this should be the fight that should definitely make up for those. Matt Brown's definitely the obvious pick here. Should have just infinitely more skill on the feet than Sanchez. I mean, getting stopped by Joe Lauzon, just crazy. Probably says more about his chin than anything, but you know, also shows that Sanchez never really had a technical striking game. But yeah, Brown, I think, should tear him up on the feet. I mean, Brown, the level of competition that each guy has faced is just, you know, incomparable. Brown just had a really tough fight with Cerrone where he pushed him to the brink, hurt Cerrone in that fight, was even competitive with him on the ground. you know, even against Maia, survived until the third round. That definitely counts for something. But then he has those fights like against Ellenberger, where he just gets kicked to the body and gets destroyed by a guy who, you know, had not looked impressive in recent fights before that. And I just have this kind of sinking feeling that Sanchez may, even though his chin is pretty much gone at this point, the way it went down to Iaquinta, I have this feeling that Sanchez, he still may be tough enough, his chin may hold up enough to survive an early onslaught from Brown and just drag him into this kind of this insane brawl where he could possibly hit some takedowns, hold Brown down, and then just outwork him or enough to steal a couple rounds and win a decision. And it would just be a horrible way for Brown to go out. And it shouldn't happen because Brown, you can see that he's been working on his ground game over the years. You know, gave Hendricks enough problems to survive in that fight, even being put on his back as much as he was. Against Cerrone, you know, attempted a triangle in that fight. The guy is not a bad ground fighter, but he can still be put on his back. And, you know, we saw against Marcin Held, if you're off your game a little bit, Sanchez can absolutely out-hustle you, get you to the ground, and just grind you out there. And I feel like Brown, he's going to be drawn into a brawl here and possibly leave himself open for some takedowns and getting outworked. I'm going to go with Brown. I'm going to go with him by decision. While he has power and he's a dangerous striker, he's not the kind of one-punch knockout striker that Iaquinta is. So I think he should, you know, have enough technique and skill to just kind of style on Sanchez here for 3 rounds. But, you know, Sanchez is tough, and if this becomes a dogfight, you know, Sanchez could catch him in an exchange, could take him down and hold him down. But I think you just can't ignore Sanchez's decline and Matt Brown's competitiveness with really high-level opponents like Maia and Cerrone in recent years. So I'm going to go with Brown, but that could be a really interesting one. All right, then the main event, Dustin Poirier versus Anthony Pettis. This is an extremely intriguing matchup. Really tough to kind of pin down a winner here. Pettis, I think, is just still a shell of himself. It seemed like the story after the Miller fight was, is Pettis back? And some people, you know, thought he was, and I just thought that was completely insane. Totally unjustified. You know, that Miller fight was a tough fight for him. He got hit early in that fight. He got taken down by Miller, almost had his back taken, and really just kind of relied on his ability to get top position and hold Miller down to win that fight. Because on the feet, you know, that was pretty even, and he got hit with some shots in that fight. So I think he's still just a shell of himself. And I think he's kind of shell-shocked by the damage that he took against RDA and Edson Barboza. If Poirier is able to make this a brawl like the Bobby Green fight, the Eddie Alvarez fight, and really land some of those bombs on Pettis, I think he has a chance of finishing him early in the fight. Pettis, though, has not been finished, you know, since he lost the belt. We know the guy can take damage. I mean, RDA just absolutely beat on him for 5 rounds, and he survived that. Wasn't really in danger of being finished in that fight. So I trust his chin to hold up, but I don't think he can engage Poirier in a firefight the way that Miller could against Poirier, common opponent for Poirier and Pettis. Yeah, I don't think that he can sit down in the pocket and trade shots with Poirier. I think that would be a very dangerous game for him, even though he's durable and has a good chin. That's not the way Pettis fights. But I also think that Poirier, he's kind of he's a little too predictable with that brawling style, and can't really hide his shots well. Can't set up openings. He's kind of reaching with a lot of those bombs he throws. Against Miller, just waited until he could back him into the fence, and then just was winging wild shots that you could really see coming. And while that worked on Alvarez, came really close to knocking him out, I think against a guy as technical and as measured as Pettis, that's going to be a style that's easy enough for Pettis to read, to figure out, and I think he could catch Poirier coming in. I do. You gotta remember, even though he's been on this decline, and I still believe is just a shell of the guy who won the belt. Against Max Holloway, even though he's kind of slowly getting picked apart and dismantled and eventually finished, he was landing shots on Holloway. That was a fairly competitive fight. He was holding his own, finding openings with his kicks, and catching Poirier coming in on occasion. And Poirier is a far more technical striker than Poirier. Poirier is really just looking to brawl and land those big power shots, and we've seen when he fights the more technical strikers like a Johnson or even a Duffy, guys who have a better sense of distance management, he struggles in those fights. So I think Poirier, if he can't get that early finish or really hurt Pettis, then I think Pettis is just going to figure him out by at round 3 at the latest, and from there I think he's just going to outstrike Poirier from range, with his taekwondo kicks and just his very patient long-range game, and possibly finish Poirier, because Poirier, if those bombs don't land, he's really going to run out of things to do. He'll be figured out, and I think Pettis might be able to hurt him on the feet down the stretch. And also, I think Pettis may be able to out-grapple Poirier here. Poirier, like Pettis, had to go to his takedowns against Miller. But I think Pettis' top control grappling, his ability to move from position to position on the ground is better than Poirier's. I think that's another facet here that Pettis might go to. Might look to take Poirier down, especially in the later rounds. But yeah, I think Pettis takes this one. He's just he hasn't looked himself since he lost the title, and I worry a little bit about Poirier's power if he's able to really go after Pettis here, really bait him into a brawl that he could hurt him and change the rest of the fight after hurting him in the early rounds, or just finish him. But Pettis hasn't been finished by anyone other than Holloway, and certainly hasn't been knocked out cold, which is what Poirier would have to do. And you know, I think even from the Bobby Green and from the Ferreira fights, since coming to lightweight, I think Poirier against Alvarez and against Jim Miller, you know, did not look like the same guy that he did in his couple of fights before that. Something seems a little off about his game, you know, really getting leg kicked repeatedly by Miller and, you know, being drawn into a really evenly contested brawl with him. And then looked good against Alvarez, but somehow, you know, if it wasn't for the controversial knee, would have ended up getting finished in that fight. So I like Pettis here. I think his technical edge will get him the win, being a more dynamic striker than Poirier. So I think I'm going to take Pettis by late finish, probably TKO, maybe 4th round. And that's another thing. I think Poirier's will gas faster and harder than Pettis. You know, Poirier, the Chan Sung Jung fight, I believe the only other fight of his that went into the 4th and 5th rounds. Or was that even a main event? Yeah, I think that was a main event. You know, kind of wilted in that fight, got put away. So that's another advantage, I think, for Pettis is the cardio. But yeah, I'm going with Pettis. I might actually end up taking a chance on this one because the more I think about it, I think you know, Pettis's technical striking, his distance management will get him the win here. Poirier is just kind of too raw now, just trying to knock people out. But that could be a tough one because you know, Pettis a little bit more fragile than he used to be, and you know, himself also physically doesn't look like the same guy. And you know, if Poirier comes out really hard, is able to land some big shots, could see him changing the fight, if not finishing Pettis right there. All right, I talked way too long about that matchup, but that's my pick, Pettis. Now we have to recap the bets, which I already mentioned, but just to say them once again. You know, I think this card's pretty straightforward, and the bets should be kept pretty lean here. I'm going to bet big on Strickland, a smaller bet on Northcutt, and possibly maybe an even smaller bet, maybe a parlay of Assuncao and Suarez. And then I'm kind of feeling like betting on Pettis here, but I do think there's some risk in that. But my main bets for this, Sean Strickland and Sage Northcutt, and the rest is, you know, you're taking on some risk there. But that's it. Thank you guys, and I'll be back next week with predictions for UFC Fight Night Verdum versus Tybura, which is a horrible card. But I'll be back with that. Follow me on Twitter at MMA Breakdown 0, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Bye.